Good morning, it's Dr. Rick, founder of Herbal411.com, and I'm going to show you one of my rituals. So I'm training for Shamrock Shuffle. Nothing against the Shamrock Shuffle, but it's like the first run of Chicago's running season, and it's obviously, it just snowed last night. So I not only am using this thing, which is my Immersion tank, but I'm using this for turning on dopamine as far as a hormone response, but I'm also using it to accelerate healing. And I'll talk to you while I'm in my tank. So it's a bit of a shock to be here. However, it does, let me just turn around so you have something to look at. It does, as I mentioned, accelerate healing. It also triggers white fat to turn to brown fat. So let me explain. White fat is a storage depot. Muscle has mitochondria. White fat doesn't have mitochondria. When you get into this kind of temperature and your body experiences cold, it turns on protocols that are throughout the body to help begin shivering and partition some of the blood flow and heat. So the objective is to initiate or trigger a chill response or a shivering response. And when you do that, your body will inherently start to cause some mitochondria to develop. That's mitochondrial biogenesis. You can do that with exercise as far as muscle developing more kind of mitochondria, but why not also add to that as far as a powerhouse of a bunch of mitochondria by turning your fat into energy stores, so to speak. So the objective would be you sit in a tank long enough to trigger that shiver response, but also the other positive thing, in addition to healing and turning on the development of brown fat, is turning on dopamine. This is like a cup of coffee in the morning. I would not do this at night. There's ways to do this and get into infrared sauna as well to do contrast baths. But at this point, I don't have a sauna. So, and the one local thing around Chicago is that it snows in the wintertime, so it's easy to keep this tank outside. Now, I don't know what I'm going to do when it turns hot. I'll probably use one of our showers. So you can tell from my voice I'm starting to shiver, and it's a 2-minute mark, so I'm finishing on this. And the other thing to consider is not necessarily to towel yourself off immediately, but to let some of the water evaporate. When you let it evaporate, it takes temperature away to evaporate, and you'll also start to shiver. Because the water's outside, pop back upstairs and get into a cold shower to get the murky water off my body. But the cool thing is you can see that I'm shivering. And how do you shiver? You shiver with muscle contraction. And what does muscle contraction need? Mitochondria. And what does mitochondria need? Energy. So by default, when the body senses ice or cold, it sends a signal to everything to start shivering. I'm shivering everywhere. And
so this is after cold exposure. I did the outside dunk tank, and then I jumped into the shower, and you can see it's blanching, which really looks like right now it's a phenomenon.
All right, so there's a couple of ideas I wanted to share with you. This is one, and I'll bring up about 3 different bullet points as far as benefits for cold water immersion. And again, you have to weigh the risks versus the benefits. If you have heart disease, well, number one, if you're not my patient, you shouldn't be watching this, because this is only for my warriors, my patients that I see at Herbal 411. Number 2, if you do have heart disease, this could be too much of a shock to your system. So get your doctor to approve you first, and or come to see me on my link down below. I'll put it here, and I will give you approval. But the problem is that it's such a shock to the system when you first start introducing it that it can set off an arrhythmia. That's a weird rhythm to the heart, such as AFib or PVCs, premature ventricular contractions. So if you have a weak heart already and then you expose yourself to cold, well, there's something that's basically called a diver reflex. And the diver reflex is when you get into cold water and you go because it's so cold. Well, your heart rate also slows down in efforts to protect you from the freezing and make all the heat go in the core of your body. Well, if you have a weak heart, and you take a deep breath, it's not a big deal. But if you have a weak heart and then your pulse rate slows down, it can lead to another arrhythmia. And if the arrhythmia, aside from bradycardia, if it's bad for you, you can go into a fatal arrhythmia. A VTAC is usually the case, or ventricular fibrillation. So the idea would be, after you've been approved, for the average weekend warrior or athlete, will cold water immersion help? And I think a thumbs up, it will help. And I've been doing it. Now that it's summer, I started filming back when the Chicago winters were still here, and it's still cold. But now that it's summer, I had to move my blue thing inside, so it's not as cold, but it's still a shock to the system every morning. And that's another thing. I wouldn't do this at night. I would do it in the morning, but I think I mentioned that already. So either way, changing your fat cells from white to brown is beneficial. So when you get into that shivering, like I showed you, I was shivering all over, I will usually, by the 2-minute mark in my tank, in my plastic tank, I'll start to shiver. And then I'll go upstairs, because I'm not sure how clean the water is. I'll go upstairs and take a cold shower. As far as cold, I turn it down to as cold as possible. I haven't measured the temperatures. If you have to pay a lot of money to get this cold water immersion, because I know some of the Lifetime Fitness places, the newer ones, have heat and cold together. You just go between the two, which is fantastic. If you have a tub or your makeshift, I've seen people put together big garage refrigerators, and they just fill it with water. They keep the temperature cold. They use that. It's great. It just takes up a lot of space, and it's expensive to buy a fridge. But even if it's just using the cold water on the faucet of your shower, I think it's still helpful if it's going to accelerate our success. What this is, it did show that you can, because of the shiver effect, turn on or convert white fat to brown fat. White fat is just a storage vehicle, a cell, in other words, an organ where you can put excessive amounts of calories. Now, you shouldn't be having excessive amounts of calories, but if you already have that fat and you wanted to get rid of it or change it to something metabolic, the idea that happens where you get this signal of freezing cold to your body is that the body's going to say, I have to create more heat. And there's shivering heat that is made because your muscles go like this, and it generates heat and your core temperature heats up. But after a while, your metabolism will accommodate to that, and it'll tell the muscles, you don't have to shake anymore, we'll just produce heat. And how do you produce heat without shaking? Mitochondria. And that's where the fat comes in handy, because the white fat is just there to store calories. The brown fat actually stores calories, but it also has a whole bunch of mitochondria. Mitochondria are those fuel factories that you find in your muscles. Well, the fuel factories can be housed in fat cells, but that's why white fat turns to brown fat, because they have a bunch of mitochondria. And the mitochondria, when signaled, there's a protocol that happens in your metabolism to defend against freezing temperature, and when signaled, they produce heat, thermogenesis. So by default, if you practice this long enough, and none of the studies said how long you actually have to practice it, but the end result, folks who used cryotherapy and were very good at it, they had biopsies and found that the fat had more mitochondria, so benefit there. To get the next step further, what does a mitochondria use to produce heat? It uses fat, uses glucose, but it can use fat in an indirect way. But if you can have more mitochondria, whether you want it for heat or not, more mitochondria equals energy. Again, this is extrapolating, but for those of you who have just fat and you want to convert it, I think cold water immersion would be great. A lot of the studies vary on how their subjects expose themselves, but I think the bottom line out of a study from Norway was that if you at least spend 11 minutes a week, that should be enough time to implement a change of the fat. So having said that, I think you can look at this study on your own and nice pictures, but you can figure out if this might be good for you. What you do have will start to create mitochondria in the fat cells. And again, because the muscles initially, when you get used to this, start to shiver, you'll create a signal to the body to develop more mitochondrial muscle too. So it makes it more effective. This study was a nice one that was done to determine if other things happen. They also talked about that brown fat conversion. In addition, mentioned about insulin sensitivity. And it does show that there's a possibility for this to take a person from insulin resistant, which is a precursor for diabetes, to insulin sensitive, which is the way you reverse metabolic syndrome. There were some really nice graphs like this one on what happens when you have cold exposure. What happens when you have cold exposure. Really nice. Again, for those of you who don't like reading literature, you got charts. So bottom line is that you have insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance. And all you have to do is expose yourself to cold. You don't have to take berberine. You don't have to do any intermittent fasting. You just have to expose yourself to roughly 11 minutes a week. And finally, this study that was just to prove whether a lot of professional football players sitting in ice tanks, maybe we should all use ice tanks, and we can't all afford those big ice tanks that are whirlpools. I mean, you can turn the faucet on the shower down and you can buy that cheap, whatever it was, $48 blue thing that I had. You can buy that online, just have to store it somewhere. And I do have a suggestion because I have a shower in my basement that never worked. And I put my outdoor blue setup into the shower area. And if I have overflow, it just goes in there. Nobody uses it anyway. But it made me think, if you don't have any space and you have a place that has tile, you might want to get one of those big tubs that you put a washer in case washers leak. There's a plastic tub, it's about 2 inches in height, and you can set the washer in there and it catches the water just in case there's a leak. Well, you could put that blue thing in the tub if you have extra space. God forbid that blue thing ever rips, but I've actually hit it with wood planks by mistake. The thickness of the rubber or plastic, whatever it is, was enough to tolerate the planks tearing into it. So the objective with this was to determine whether it really helped. It said actually that using cold water immersion was just as good as active healing. That's when you exercise, you do some HIIT or some strength training, or you do some cardio, and then to help heal, you actually do some light work, usually a bike or a treadmill, will actually help muscle move because you're forcing more blood flow, you're forcing movement. The study said essentially cold water immersion was exactly the same as that. The introduction of active recovery makes an athlete feel better. And if they feel better, they can get back into the next exercise with more vigor. What I'm postulating is that the people that did cold water immersion had a subjective feeling of healing faster. And that's where the placebo response will come in. If it was placebo response, and that's a problem with a lot of these studies, they're small studies, except for, but one of them was just to like a meta-analysis. If you had placebo response and it gets your athlete to get back into exercise faster per unit of 1 week time, you'll have more volume of exercise. More volume of exercise over the course of a couple months to a year will get you either your faster speed, your bigger strength, cool hypertrophy, but it'll get you to the summit faster. Even if it is placebo, as long as it doesn't cause harm, as long as it doesn't cost a lot of money, I think it's worth it. I read more into the insulin sensitive paper, and it also said it improved ApoB, and for those of you with elevated cholesterols, ApoB, if you have a high level of it, it increases your chances for some form of cardiovascular outcome in the future when you get older. And if you can reduce ApoB with diet, great. If you can reduce it with medicines and statins, great. If you can reduce it with cold water exposure, there's no harm with this. Unless blue tank rips and you flood your house and get mold. I guess you can die of mold. That's not good, especially if you're an asthmatic. I think that the risk versus the benefits, cold water immersion's a thumbs up. One more thing. So you guys saw how my fingers turned white. And there is a response that occurs, but it's not detrimental. I'm not saying that all of you will have the same response. That could be the early signs of Raynaud's phenomenon with me. And if it is, I'll live through it, but what I try to do is keep my hands out of the cold as much as possible because it actually hurts my fingers. Whether that turns into a problem down the line, I have to talk to my vascular specialist to get their ideas. And I'll be doing the next video on how to use these heat sinks. There's a Palmar heat sink, there's a globular heat sink, and there's a sole of the foot heat sink that can actually give you 300 plus improvement in exercise tolerance in the long run. I'll be doing that later. Again, if you subscribe, you'll see it. There's no downsides to this. There's only benefits. Even if it's anecdotal benefits or it's placebo response, I think it's worth it. So give it a try. If you have any questions, put them in the comments section down below. There are other doctors that are doing more detailed response, like Rhonda Patrick or Andrew Huberman. He's a biologist and a neuroscientist, and I think if you can sit through the entire 1 hour or so, it would be worth it to take some notes. Just FYI, the reason I got into this was because I did Exodus 90. I'm Catholic. Exodus 90 from January until Easter is a commitment to cold showers, no snacks, decreasing your social media exposure, and then worship about an hour a day. And it was a challenge that my son and I did. Luckily, we're both finishers to the Exodus 90. I think it was very spiritually uplifting, but obviously Easter is over, resurrection of Christ is done. However, I'm going to continue because I think it's just cool. I think it's good to implement as much in your corner that will get you to the next level of health. I think there's no downside to this except for the $48 I spent. Having a limit to the amount of social media that I dive into, I just took away Facebook and Instagram from my phone, and it's very distracting, but it is a good platform for giving you guys the information. But for those of you who follow Catholic practice, think about this. I'll be having or hosting my own, what's called a fraternity for guys only. Girls have their own equivalent of Exodus 90 called Fiat, but it starts in January 2024. Become a subscriber. As we roll around into next winter, I'll be opening up to whoever wants to follow and join my fraternity. And it's pretty cool because we lock elbows together to get through spiritual practice in addition to staying super healthy. And that's my objective, is always these videos I make to shortcut your climb to stardom and super health. So thanks for watching up at this point in time. I'll try to answer many questions as I can. Otherwise, I'll see you at the next video. Thank you.